Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We're in the book of Yehoshua, Joshua, and I should tell you, I'm hoping at least to be able to finish tonight and next week. The book of Yehoshua, we've been on this book for approximately 4 or 5 classes, and if my planning goes well, it will be tonight and next week, and then we'll move on to the Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges. So we're going to start on chapter 13. That's what we're up to. And we're going to be going a little bit faster. And the reason is that from this chapter to the end, it's very, very detailed about the inheriting the land. I would say most of what are called the famous stories from the book of Yehoshua we've already done. There's still some very interesting and important ideas that we'll be dealing with, but at this point we'll be going a little bit quicker and not dealing with so many of the details. So chapter 13 begins, the first verse of chapter 13. Yehoshua zaken b'yamim, v'yomer Hashem elav, ata zekanta, bata b'yamim, v'ha'aretz nishara harbe ma'od l'rishta. God comes to Yehoshua and says, first of all, it says Yehoshua became elderly and he came into days. This is the same expression used with Avram. When Avram, after Sarah passes away, it says, Avram zaken ba b'yamim, Hashem beirach et Avram bakol. Avram came in, became elderly, and came into days, and God blessed him with everything. So here the expression is the same thing. Yehoshua became elderly, he came into days, and God said to him, you have become elderly, coming into days, and there is still much of the land that needs to be occupied. So in other words, in chapter 12, we went through the 31 kings that Yehoshua had defeated. And we made the comment there that it almost sounds like he conquered half the world, 31 kings. But we learned that at that time, every city had its own king. Every city was its own kingdom, its own world. And so when it says that Yehoshua defeated 31 kings, it was actually not even near all of the small Eretz Yisrael that he needed to conquer. And God is pointing out to him that there's still much to be done here. So, first of all, if he's coming into days, we'll learn later, Yehoshua passes away at age 110, which is exactly the same number of years of Yosef. We already learned from the Arizal that Yehoshua is considered a reincarnation of Yosef. So it's not a coincidence that they both passed away at that age. And then, I'm just mentioning this because it's very, very current. Then it goes through all the different areas that Yehoshua still had not conquered. And in the 3rd verse, it talks about Chameshet Sarnei Plishtim, the 5 leaders of the Philistines. Ha'azati, those from Azza, Ashdodi, from Ashdod, Ha-Ashkeloni from Ashkelon, Hagiti from Gat, which today is called Kiryat Gat, Ha-Akroni. So 4 of the 5 are names given to that area to this day. Ashdod, well, Azza is still Azza. Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gat are like right near there. And we pointed out, and everyone's going to have to kind of do their own research here because it's so detailed. But we've seen throughout the book of Yehoshua, there have been scores and scores and scores of names of places that Yehoshua either fought against or Israel settled in. And the important comment is many of these names became names of cities and villages all over Israel, but not necessarily in the place that they were. Now, many of these names, it's not clear where they were even then, let alone now, but it is quite interesting that 100 years ago, when Jews began really coming to Israel in mass, and they had to pick names for different cities and villages and towns, they used the biblical names. So in this chapter, like many of the other chapters, there's lots of names of places. But here, because especially this last year, we've been fighting in Gaza, and especially the first 3-4 months, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Kiryat Gat were running to the bomb shelters like 5 times a day. Thank God things have quieted down somewhat, because for all practical purposes, as a fighting force, we have defeated Hamas. Unfortunately, they still exist somewhat as a political entity, mostly because they are stealing all of the relief food coming in. And since they control the food, they still control Gaza. It's reported that the people in Gaza are pretty sick of Hamas and the disaster that they brought upon them. But that's a different discussion. And so in the middle of the 13th chapter, they begin, this is a new process, to parcel out the inheritances among the tribes. And it's mentioned, this is already in the 14th chapter, that a very important fact is it took them 7 years to conquer as much of Eretz Yisrael as they could before they began to apportion the inheritances. In other words, it took 7 years for the wars to be fought. And then it took another 7 years for the distribution of the land to the various tribes. So why did it take so long? As we're going to see as we get a few more chapters from now, because a lot of the land wasn't conquered, then it made it very difficult to apportion the land, when it meant, and we discussed this, and I remember David brought this up, this idea of each tribe fighting for their inheritance. And there we learned that that's not how it was supposed to go. It was supposed to be that all of Israel fought together to conquer all of the land and then apportion it. But we see it didn't turn out that way exactly. And that is the first verse we read here, that God said there's still a lot of land that needs to be conquered. And so the wars continued. And in the next chapters, we'll see how it develops. But in the 13th chapter, it mentions, and will mention again and again, that the tribe of Levi got no land inheritance. And it's mentioned, it's like sprinkled through the last approximately 10 chapters of the book of Yehoshua, that as each tribe is getting their inheritance, it mentions again, but Levi did not get an inheritance. And this goes back to the 5 books of Moshe, where God determined that the Levim would not have their own portion, because as God said, I am their portion. But we will see that they were apportioned 42 cities. So it's not like they had nothing. They had 42 cities spread out all over Israel. And among those cities were the cities of refuge, which is discussed prominently in the 5 books of Moshe. So according to tradition, we entered Eretz Yisrael, according to the Jewish calendar, in the year 2488. That is the year that we entered into Eretz Yisrael after the 40 years in the desert, 2488. And they fought for 7 years. So in 2495, they began to apportion the land, and it took approximately 7 years to apportion the land. And here we have some very, very important ideas that in chapter 14, so it begins that the first ones that were apportioned their inheritance were the 2.5 tribes on the other side of the Jordan. And this was mentioned in the Torah, and again in the book of Yehoshua, this idea that the 2.5 tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh wanted their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan. But Moshe said, you can settle there, but not unless you fight with all of Israel to conquer the other side of the Jordan. And the book of Yehoshua, we've gone over this already. The 2.5 tribes fulfilled their promise. And now that the 7 years of conquest is over, we see that they are the first ones, because they're going to go back now on the other side of the Jordan. And they now officially will inherit that land. And we mentioned a number of times that in the original Balfour Declaration, the country called Jordan, which had never existed in all of history, there was never, ever a country called Jordan, that was supposed to be the Jewish homeland, what we call Israel now, and all of Jordan. And then for political reasons, the English who ruled this part of the world, they split off Jordan to reward some of their supporters, the Hashemite kingdom. And so Israel, really 3/4 of what was supposed to be Israel, and was in biblical times, it was split off. And what remains is what we call Eretz Yisrael, Medina Yisrael. So in chapter 14, it talks about how they are now being rewarded, and they're the first to receive their inheritance. Now, we do have to say a number of very, very important things about the inheritance in general, as it will apply to the rest of the book of Yehoshua, is that the inheritances were given over in 3 different ways. One is through the word of God, and that is very, very connected to the blessings that Yaakov and Moshe gave to the tribes, because they were speaking in divine inspiration, in a state of prophecy from God. And in the blessings are hinted for many of the tribes where they would end up as having their inheritance. But in the parsha of Pinchas, God says that the way that the land will be divided is by goral, by lottery. But the lottery was done in conjunction with the high priest and the Urim V'Tumim. So there's three different ways here that the inheritance is happening. There's a level that the inheritance is coming straight from God, prophetically, where each tribe would settle. It would be done through a lottery, but the lottery would be connected to the Urim V'Tumim, meaning that it wasn't like a matter of what we call luck or coincidence, because they did like a lottery. They pulled out the name of a tribe from, let's say, one hat, and from the other hat, it wasn't a hat, it was a box. They would pull out the territorial geographical inheritance. But we're told that it all happened exactly the way it was supposed to be. It wasn't by chance. It wasn't, and that was the importance of there being the Urim and the Tumim there, and the high priest, because the Urim and Tumim was a type of mystical, divine providence, divine inspiration that would determine certain things. And so here you had the word of God, the lottery, and the Urim V'Tumim. And that's discussed in the book of Yehoshua. Now, we have to mention a super important disagreement that it was basically between Rashi and Ramban. And we have to remember, I already gave the year when this inheritance happened, 2,495. Well, now we're at 5,785. So 3,300 years have gone by. And we know from the Talmud, with all the discussion, there are certain ideas or facts or laws that we have an unbroken, clear tradition what they are. But we know from the Talmud there's so many things that there are disagreements. And the disagreements are coming approximately 1,300 years later in this particular case. And then Rashi and Ramban are a full 1,000 years after that. So the disagreement between Rashi and Ramban is approximately 2,300 years after the land was apportioned according to the tribes. And so they had different traditions of how did it work. In a simple fact, a tribe that was bigger than another tribe, did they get more land or not? So Rashi says that the division of the land was not equal. The bigger the tribe, the bigger the portion. The Ramban, who very often disagrees with Rashi, disagreed, and he said it was not according to how large the tribe was in population. Every tribe got an equal amount of land. But what wasn't equal was the individual families. So in other words, if one tribe, let's say had 20,000 households, and another one had 40,000, well, the land mass will be exactly the same for the entire tribe, but according to the Ramban, would be smaller per family. And Rashi says that they were all, That's what Rashi would say. They were all equal. No, I'm going back. Rashi says the tribes, what they got were not equal, but the individual tribes, families would get more or less equal. And the Ramban is saying very, very different, is that the land mass for each tribe was equal, but the individual family got less. So this is a disagreement 2,300 years later. It's one of those things that we don't have an absolute clear tradition. It seems that when you look at a map, at least of what we think the apportioning of the land was, it appears it was more like Rashi, that it wasn't equal, the landmass of each tribe. So that's just a very important thing to keep in mind for the rest of the book of Yehoshua as they're dividing up the land. And then there's another disagreement in the Gemara. The families who are inheriting, is it according to the families that were in the desert for 40 years? Or is it according to the families as they existed when they came into the land? And so there is a subtle difference, because the people died and the heads of families changed, and the amount of people in each family also changed. So there also is two different opinions. And truthfully, we really won't ever know, but these are the opinions. Was it divided according to the heads of the families that left Egypt, or is it for those who came in to the land? So this is just two very, very important things to keep in mind as we go through the chapters that talk about the apportioning of the land. So now in the 14th chapter, a good part of the portion is made up of one particular incident. And that comes, it's really starting in verse 6 and goes all the way to the end of the 14th chapter. And that is, and I'll read it here, V'yomer elav Kalev ben Yefuneh Haknizi. He's talking to Yehoshua. So Kalev ben Yefuneh is talking to Yehoshua and says, Ata yadata et davar asher diber Hashem el Moshe, that you know what God had spoke to Moshe, Isha Elokim, the man of God, Al Adotai ve'al Odotecha b'Kadesh Barnea, about the facts about me and you at Kadesh Barnea. So what is being said here? If you remember, 12 spies were sent by Moshe to spy out the land. The idea was they would come back and we would go into the land. This was the beginning of the second year in the desert. As we know, 10 of the spies came back with what we'll call an evil report and basically said, they're too strong for us. We will never be able to conquer the land. 2 of them, Yehoshua and Kalev, they spoke up and said, God promised us, of course we can go into the land. And as part of that whole thing, we end up wandering in the desert for 40 years. They were in the land for 40 days. So the Torah says, a year for a day, a year for a day. So they were there for 40 days. We would wander for 40 years until a new generation would come into the land, except for Yehoshua and Kalev. because they spoke out for God and for going into the land and conquering it. And so chapter 14 goes over how Caleb approaches Yehoshua, reminds him of this whole story, and that God had promised that the two of them, of all of the men between 20 and 60, they would be the only ones that would come into the land. And so there are a lot of verses that talk about this, and Caleb is making his point, and he mentions that he was 40 years old, and at this incident of the spies, and now he's 85. And so the way it works is Caleb was 38 years old when they left Egypt. The whole story of the spies is in the second year, so he became 40, as he mentions here. And then he comes into the land. He's actually, he was 38. So he when he comes into the land, he is 78, but he's talking now after 7 years of war. So he says, now I'm 80, I'm 85. So that's just giving us like a time frame of what is happening here. And then he mentions that what he's really asking for is he wants his inheritance in Hebron. Why Hebron? He reminds Yehoshua that when they went to Israel to spy it out, so the Torah says in Parshat Shlach Lecha that Caleb by himself went to the, now we call it Marat Machpelah. He went to the burial place of Avram and Sarah, Yitzhak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, according to tradition, Adam and Chava. That's why Hebron was called Kiryat Arba, the place of the four couples. And he prayed there. And he prayed that he would be strong enough to counter what he was already feeling, that the spies might have different motivations here. And so according to tradition, he went to Hebron. And now he's reminding Yehoshua, that's why I'm asking for Hebron. And he says, and God basically told Moshe that that's what should be. But if you look at Parshat Shlach Lecha, it never says that. Never says explicitly that God said to Moshe, make sure that Caleb gets an inheritance for Hebron because of his standing up for my promise to bring Israel into the land. So it's part of the whole discussion here, but it's understood that by Ruach HaKodesh, Yehoshua understood that what Caleb was saying was correct, that God had promised Hebron to Yehoshua, and so therefore he gives him Hebron as his inheritance. And the very last verse of the 14th chapter says, V'ha'aretz shakta milchama, and the land became quiet from war. Now again, this is after the 7 years of fighting to conquer the war, to conquer the land of Israel. But we already saw in the beginning of the 13th chapter, God said there's still a lot left. So how do we understand that basically the war was over? So 3 different ideas are given. One, and that is also hinted where it says, Yehoshua Zaken Ba b'yamim. Yehoshua became elderly, and he came into days. So one of the opinions is that Yehoshua simply did not have the strength anymore to fight the wars. He conquered as much as he could, and he stopped. We'll see the ramifications of that. A second opinion is that the people had enough. 7 years of war is a lot. Here, we're in like the 15th month of the war here. And to even conceive of it continuing for another 5.5 years is like, don't even say that. So that the people were just tired. They had done as much as they could. And the third opinion was that the nations around us stopped fighting us and attacking us as well. Because a lot of these wars, we took the initiative. A lot of times the nations felt, let's attack Israel before they get to us. And the nations became tired. So that's what this verse means, that all of a sudden, the country was quiet. And so therefore, in these chapters, every once in a while, it will mention that a certain people among the nations, they were not conquered, but they remained where they were. And in certain cases, they paid taxes to Israel. They understood that Israel had taken over the majority of the land. They were the rulers now. So these small groups of people, remember, each city was like a kingdom in itself. So all over Israel, little pockets of nations remained in Israel. We were not able to conquer them. And this is very, very similar to our situation today. In 1948, we did not conquer all of the land. And many, obviously, Arabs, Christian Arabs, Muslim Arabs, Druze, remained in the land. And that's how it is to this day. So the whole book of Yehoshua, even though it seems that we're reading about something very long ago, is actually very, very relevant to today. Extremely relevant to today. Now we go to the 15th chapter. And here, the inheritances on this side of the Jordan began. Remember, in the previous 2 chapters, the 2.5 tribes got their inheritance on the other side. The first tribe to get its inheritance is Yehuda. And as I said, it's very, very detailed. It mentions a lot of names of places and families, and I've only picked out like the most important parts of it. And so in chapter 15, so Caleb is from the tribe of Yehuda. And so it's talking about the inheritance of Yehuda, and Caleb gets what he asked for. But here there's a very, very interesting idea. And that is when Caleb gets his inheritance in Hebron. So one of the neighboring cities was called Kiryat Sefer, which is very interesting because in the area that I live, which is fairly distant from Hebron, one of the biggest places in my area is called Kiryat Sefer. It's an all Haredi city. And I do a lot of my shopping there and different services in Kiryat Sefer, named after this. But apparently then Kiryat Sefer was somewhere near Hebron. And so Kalev says, whoever can conquer Kiryat Sefer, he can marry my daughter. And the 15th chapter talks about that she was apparently exceedingly beautiful. And it says that Othniel conquered Kiryat Sefer, and Kalev allowed his daughter, or gave his blessing for his daughter to marry Othniel. And so this is somewhat similar to another very, very famous story when Goliath was challenging Israel. And he was a giant and had a giant reputation, and people were very scared. And so Shaul, who was king then, said, whoever can defeat Goliath can marry my daughter Michal. And of course, it was David who defeated Goliath, and he married Michal. So it's a very similar kind of phenomenon. But what's interesting here is that, and in the Mamloez, he takes the opportunity to talk about Pardes, the way of learning according to the literal meaning Pshat, the alluded to meaning Remez, the symbolic, allegorical, metaphorical level called Drush, and the spiritual, mystical, Kabbalistic level called Sod, Pardes. And he mentions there that in the text, we have the story. The story is that Kalev wanted to defeat Kiryat Sefer. Othniel accomplishes this. He marries his daughter. And then it tells a story about how his daughter asks her father, we need some fields around the city of Kiryat Sefer, that we need to be able to support ourselves. And so he gives the fields also to Othniel and his daughter. But what's interesting is in the Gemara, they explain this whole incident completely differently. And they say there is a pshat to it, there's a literal meaning to it, but there's a whole other level happening here. And first of all, we have to understand who Othniel is. Othniel is considered the third in the line of transmission of the Torah. In Pirkei Avot, it begins, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. Umasrua leYoshua. And he passed it on to Yehoshua. Yehoshua leZakenim. And Yehoshua passed it on to the elders. So that's the line of transforming, of transition of the Masorah, the tradition. And so here we're told that when it says in Pirkei Avot to the elders, the elder was Othniel. And so the sages say, first of all, you have to understand the word Kiryat Sefer means literally the city of the book. Kiryat, the place of the book, Kiryat Sefer. And so the sages read it, and I remember we learned this at the very, very first class, that there's a tradition that when Moshe died, And there's different opinions how many halachas were forgotten. Some say as many as 3,000 halachas were forgotten. I believe others say it was 1,000 halachas were forgotten. And this actually was a reason for mourning. And so it says, the tradition is that Othniel was a genius of geniuses, and he was able, through logic and deep understanding, to regain or recapture those halachas and bring them back into force. And so that's how the sages read this. Yehoshua, who he was in Moshe's tent all the time, but even he forgot these halachas. And so he says, whoever can restore these halachas, I'll give my daughter. And it was Othniel who restored the halachas. And so here you have like two levels of story, and they don't have to contradict each other. Is that Othniel could have won a physical battle for the physical city called Kiryat Sefer, but there's obviously a deeper understanding here of what this battle was. Othniel was battling to restore the halachas. The 16th chapter begins the next inheritance of Ephraim. And this is of basically of Yosef. But we know that Yosef, as far as inheritance, was divided between Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Ephraim comes next. And I just want to mention at the end of the 15th chapter, it says, and as I said, it's peppered within the different inheritances, which people they were not able to conquer and who ended up staying in the land. And one of them at the end of the 15th chapter is about Yerushalayim. And that was the Yevusi. They were not able to conquer Yerushalayim and the Yevusi. And this waited for David. This waited for approximately 300 years until David conquered Yerushalayim and made it the eternal capital of Israel until this day. So in the 16th chapter, it's the inheritance of Ephraim. And again, it's just a lot of details. In the 17th chapter, so we have a number of important things, because in the beginning of the 17th chapter, it's mentioned something that we know back from the book of Bamidbar, that here it's the division of not only Ephraim, but Manasseh also. And back in the book of Bamidbar, it says that one of the heads of the families of Manasseh was Selofchad. And Selofchad had no sons. And the way that the Torah had explained inheritances, up to that point, it appeared that only men could inherit land in Israel. And so the story is in the parsha of right after Pinchas, is that the 5 daughters of Selofchad approached Moshe. It's actually in Parshat Matot, and says that they approached Moshe and said, our father has no sons. Why shouldn't we be able to inherit? And Moshe said, I don't know the answer. I'll ask God. And Moshe asks God, and God agrees with the 5 daughters of Zelophehad and explains how women can also inherit the land. So in the 17th chapter, because now it's time to inherit the land, so it mentions that it mentions the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, and they are Machla, Benoah, Chagla, Milcah, Betirza, the same names that are mentioned in the book of Bamidbar. And they approach Elazar, the Kohen Gadol, and Yehoshua, and they remind him that God himself said that they could inherit. And so here we see that they inherit in Eretz Yisrael. So that's in the 17th chapter. And I'm going to finish with the 18th chapter. And that way, hopefully next week, we will be able to finish the book. And this is very, very important because in the beginning of the 18th chapter, so it says, V'yikalu kol adapnei Yisrael Shilo, v'yishkanu sham et oel moed, v'aretz nichbasha lifnehem. And so it says that all of Israel gathered together at Shilo. Shilo became the place where the Mishkan stood the longest. I believe it mentions in the Gemara that there were actually 8 different places that the Mishkan was at until there was a temple in Jerusalem. But by far, many of them were just for a few years. But in Shilo, it was approximately 350 years. The Mishkan was in Shilo. And when we get to the book of Shmuel, we'll see that. We'll see after all of the judges at the time, and then Shmuel, the Mishkan was still in Shilo. The innovation here, though, is that they built walls around the Mishkan. So it became more like a building. It was still the Mishkan, which was an ohel, which was a tent, basically, made out of fabrics. But here they built a wall around it, but still over, they had the curtains, the tapestries. So it's still called the Ohel Moed. It was still called a tent, but here it took on a little bit of a more permanent status. And the place Shilo still exists today, a very, very historic place, and it is the place where the Mishkan was. They've done excavations, and it's the real place. And the rest of chapter 18 it makes clear that there were still 7 more tribes that needed their inheritance. That the 2.5 got theirs, and we see that Yehuda got, and Ephraim got, and then Benjamin got in the 18th chapter. And so what happened here is interesting, and I think I mentioned it before because we had a discussion, and David brought up this idea of why didn't each tribe fight for their own inheritance? So we already answered that it was supposed to be that all of Israel would conquer all of Israel and then divide up the land, but it didn't happen. So in the chapter 18, this becomes very, very important. There are still 7 tribes that don't have their inheritance yet because the land has not been conquered. And so this begins a process that Yehoshua chooses 3 people from each of the tribes. And it doesn't say this exactly. I'm putting the name. They were like surveyors. And so he sent them out. Now remember, the tribes knew more or less already from the blessings of Yaakov and Moshe and through Ruach HaKodesh where they would end up, but it wasn't exact. So he sent for these 7 tribes these representatives, I'll call them surveyors, and he told them, go and measure out the land according to the tribes. And remember, we learned already that the wars had stopped. The nations were not fighting against Israel at this point, and Israel wasn't fighting against the nations. And so the tribes could go to their inheritances. The difference would be that whatever peoples were still there are going to end up remaining there. This became very problematic, because as we'll see in the book of Judges, this set off many, many, many different wars between the people who were still in Israel, around Israel, and many ongoing wars almost all the time. But in chapter 18, they go out and they measure the land, and then they come back and they do it by Goral, by the lottery, and by the Urim and Tumim. And again, it was all coming from God, because it all ended up, each tribe got exactly the land that they were supposed to do. That was almost the miracle of the lottery, that it was an exact replica of God's will of where each of the tribes would be. So that takes us through chapter 18. At the end of chapter 18, Binyamin starts to get its inheritance. And like I said, many of these chapters are very, very detailed. But it will end with this, that the question is asked, why Binyamin? Like, who established the order? First it was Yehuda, and then it was, first of all, the 2.5 tribes, then it was Yehuda, and then it was Ephraim, and then Manasseh got its other half in Israel, and then Binyamin. So the question is asked, well, who established that order? And it's not 100% clear, but one of them is in order of importance, because Yehuda, the kings come from Yehuda. So he's clearly of the more important of all of the tribes. And Ephraim and Manasseh are from Yosef. And so Yosef also was close to Yehuda in importance. But then Binyamin. So they ask, well, why Binyamin? So what's interesting is that of the places where the Mishkan was, the most important ones were in Binyamin. Shilo is in Binyamin. Nov and Givon are also in the territory of Binyamin. But even more important is the temple was built in Binyamin. And it was actually right at the border of Binyamin and Yehuda. But basically, the temple was in Binyamin. And that's why in the blessing that Binyamin gets from Yaakov, it says, Ubein kitafav shachen. Between his shoulders, the divine presence will dwell. And anyone who has been to Yerushalayim knows that the Temple Mount is between mountains and hills. It's not flat. And so it's like in between the shoulders are like mountains, and in between sits the Temple Mount. And that's the idea here, why Binyamin is next, is because for the next, and I think, I'm not positive, but I think the Mishkan was in Shilo for 369 years. I mentioned 350 as an approximate, but I'm not positive, but I think it was 369 years. And then eventually it was in Yerushalayim, in Benjamin's territory. So in the end of chapter 18, Benjamin now gets his inheritance. So end with a bracha that all of us can find our inheritance, our portion in the Holy Land.